Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Roland Green, director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another event in our series, Inside the Center, highlighting the research conducted here by current and recent fellows. The series seeks to direct a spotlight on some of the most provocative, groundbreaking, and unusual work that is happening under our roof. Every year, we host 30 to 40 fellows working on projects that raise difficult questions, change the conversation, and generally make a difference. And now that we've been online for a year or so, and by the way, we're committed to maintaining an online presence even after the pandemic, we're enjoying the opportunity to share our fellows' research with the Stanford community and with the rest of the world. Whoever you may be, a current fellow, a former fellow returning for a visit, a college or high school teacher, or a member of the public, please consider yourself a member of the SHC community now and feel welcome to join us often. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom, CC, it says, to start or stop viewing captioning. The up arrow adjacent to the CC icon allows you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, and adjust captions as needed. When I became director of the Stanford Humanities Center in the fall of 2019, on the eve of our 40th anniversary celebration, it seemed to me the occasion to expand the center's programs and to uphold our distinctive office on campus, which is to bring the freshest, most exciting ideas in the broader humanities to Stanford. Today's event belongs to one new series, Inside the Center, but we have launched 3 others that run in counterpoint to each other. One called How Change Comes, featuring scholars whose research lends itself to concrete, institutionalized commitments to social justice. One titled All This Rising, that explores new work by figures whose influence will crest over the next 10 years. And one for our local community, introducing new members of our faculty. With this particular series, which was our first venture into online programming last summer, we talk about how exciting intellectual work is made in philosophy, music, art history, and all the humanities disciplines. And we intend to give special attention to new, unpublished, or soon to be published research, as with today's talk. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to mention that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. If you'd like to submit a question to the speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we will do our best to get to it following the lecture. And now let me introduce Professor Marci Kwon, who is a Humanities Center Fellow during this academic year. She will be discussing her new book, Enchantments, Joseph Cornell and American Modernism, which is to be published this week, Friday of this week to be exact. Professor Kwon is Assistant Professor of Art and Art History at Stanford, where she focuses on the art and culture of the United States. Her research and teaching interests include the intersection of fine art and vernacular practice, theories of modernism, cultural exchange between Asia and the Americas, folk and self-taught art, and issues of race and objecthood. At Stanford, she is a faculty affiliate of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, Asian American Studies, African and African American Studies, American Studies, the Center for East Asia, and Feminist and Gender Studies, to give you an idea how widely she travels on campus. And she serves on the steering committee of the program in modern thought and literature. Together with Elisa Alexander, she co-directs the Cantor Art Center's Asian American Art Initiative. She is a recipient of the Asian American Studies Faculty Prize, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity Teaching Award, and the Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Award. Marci, thank you for joining us today. I know that we've got a big audience of Stanford people, but also a big national and international audience looking forward to hearing you talk about the work. So welcome, and please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Roland. And thank you to everyone for being here today. I'd also like to thank the staff of the Humanities Center for flawlessly organizing this event, as well as all of your efforts in kind of creating community and keeping the program going this year. And I want to mention that this book benefited enormously from a manuscript review workshop at the Humanities Center a few years ago, which was a program founded by Carolyn Winterer and was organized by Kelda Jameson and Andrea Davies. And I'm really grateful to all of them, as well as to my various colleagues who participated in that. So I'm just going to begin and share my screen. Okay. Okay. So in 1947, Joseph Cornell jotted down a memory from some 20 years earlier. At once impressionistic and precise, his diary entry describes an autumn afternoon in New York City. The year is 1927, 4 years before Cornell made his first documented work of art. On this day, he took a seat on a trolley car, paging through a book of poetry by Walt Whitman and a compendium of Christian Science psalms as Broadway whizzed by. Then he looked up. The brass knob, what a revelation it was, of the motorman, conductor shined to equivalent of Brancusi's golden bird from constant manipulation of gloved hands. At this moment, Cornell discovered an equivalence between the trolley car's brass knob and Constantine Brancusi's iconic golden bird, which he had seen a year earlier at the Brummer Gallery. Both bronze and brass had been polished to a golden gleam by the labor of their respective makers. And although one was a sculpture and the other a common implement burnished by rote motion, Cornell experienced a glow of exhilaration in both. The glide of the trolley wheels over iron and wood tracks, the experience of reading Whitman and the Psalms, at the autumnal weather and light. For Cornell, these nuances of detail were far from inconsequential. Rather, they formed an inextricable part of experience, as interconnected as knob and sculpture. Upon seeing the motorman's knob and linking it to Brancusi's work, literature, art, city, and life became one. What a revelation it was, the artist marveled. Enchantments, Joseph Cornell and American Modernism, tracks the artist's attempts to give form to such experiences. For the artist, enchantment, an experience that exceeds rational explanation, was located not in some distant firmament, but in the world around him. From this vantage, anything, a fragment of driftwood, a found photograph, a trapeze trick, holds the numinous power traditionally seen as the exclusive purview of religion or fine art. Spanning 4 decades of the artist's career, this book also examines Cornell's engagement with key episodes in American modernism, including the transatlantic migration of Surrealism and Ballet, Abstract Expressionism, New York School poetry, and experimental cinema, to show how this ostensibly anti-modern sensibility formed a crucial, if under-recognized, thread of American modernism. So for those of you who are not familiar with Cornell, I'll begin by offering a brief overview of his practice. I'll then discuss the book's broader historical and theoretical claims before moving to a case study drawn from my 3rd chapter. Joseph Cornell worked as an artist from 1931 until his death in 1972. He is best known for his box constructions, but also made collages, which as an avid cinephile, he called montages, films, and was a practicing graphic designer, creating layouts for popular publications such as Vogue and Harper's Bazaar, as well as more specialist publications. Cornell was born in 1903 on Christmas Eve, the oldest son of an upper middle class family. His idyllic childhood in Nyack, New York, was cut short by the death of his father in 1917. At age 14, Joseph became head of a household that included his mother, 2 sisters, and a younger brother, Robert, who had cerebral palsy. Cornell supported his mother and brother for the rest of their lives, working as a textile salesman in the 1920s and a graphic designer through the 1950s, all while making art. For the artist, quotidian events such as browsing the secondhand shops of New York City or riding his bike through Queens engendered evanescent moments of beauty, peace, and spirituality. The artist's work, as well as his extensive diary entries and vast collection of books, clippings, and assorted materials, attest to his desire to preserve and communicate such moments. These convictions were inseparable from his love for his brother Robert, seen on the right in a work that Cornell made of Robert just a year after Robert's death. The Cornell brothers converted to Christian Science in 1929 after visits to the church seemed to alleviate Robert's symptoms. Among Christian Science's foundational beliefs is the idea that any illness might be cured simply by acknowledging the human body as a manifestation of God's perfection and therefore incapable of being ill. Within Christian Science ontology, God is synonymous with the world itself and palpably present in all its manifestations. The world is not a mere reflection of God in a Platonic sense, it is God. As William James noted of all mind cure religions, Christian Science included, theirs is a theology of immanence, or a, quote, doctrine of the oneness of our life with God's life. Many visitors to the Cornell home on Utopia Parkway assumed Robert's physical disabilities meant diminished mental capacities. This could not have been further from the truth. For Joseph, living with Robert was a constant reminder that appearances do not constitute reality. Cornell's experiences of enchantment were agonizingly brief, and he was plagued by his inability to preserve such moments and capture them in physical form. Throughout this book, I discuss Cornell's work as characterized by this interplay of belief and doubt. Although the artist was a believer, he did not live in a state of perpetual enchantment, but struggled to hold on to those fleeting moments of presence and grace. I'd better get this down before it evaporates, he wrote after one particularly potent experience. Because of these convictions, Cornell is, despite the best efforts of other Cornell scholars, still seen as a hermetic figure, disengaged from the so-called real world and lost in dreams. Such descriptions pained the artist. In a 1944 letter to poet Mina Loy, he wrote of seeing a, quote, smoked fish delivery truck adorned with paintings of fat pieces of meat surrounded by whole fish in colors that make one think it might have been, at one time, been bright decalcomania, silvery whites and grays. Cornell continued, all of the above seems sometimes so evanescent and nebulous that I have never mentioned the trifle to anyone. I have generally paid a pretty high price for the above kind of experience, however silly this might sound to some. Why and how did such convictions come to be understood as silly? One diagnosis comes from Max Weber's infamous description of modernity as the disenchantment of the world in his speech Science's Vocation. Weber defines disenchantment as modernity's loss of a higher unifying power, religious or otherwise. An impoverished rationalism arose in its place, wrenching the world into distinct spheres governed by their own internal logic rather than divine law. Weber's disenchantment thesis describes this loss of faith as the defining condition of modernity. Within such a narrative, Cornell's enchantment can only be understood as escapist or anti-modern. In this book, I approach enchantment and its antonym, disenchantment, as contingent and contested historical constructs rather than ontological certainties. Cornell's changing reception suggests the way that mid-century American art was shaped by disputes over the meaning and political stakes of enchantment's perceived power. By tracking Cornell's peregrinations through a number of overlapping cultural spheres, I shed light on the ways debates about enchantment and disenchantment were mobilized in period conversations over art's relationship to the public, to popular culture, and its potential for moral authority. To be enchanted is to enter a state that defies explanation by rational thought, leading to enchantment's underbelly, its association with trickery, sorcery, and delusion. Enchantment is a plunge into the realm beyond everyday life, beyond the material world. Thus, to be enchanted would seem to risk losing touch with the so-called real world. Because of its associations with mysterious and ungovernable realms and forces, enchantment is ineluctably entangled with power, how it is characterized, where it is located, and who controls it. My first chapter explores Cornell's artistic formation in the 1920s. During this decade, Romanticism, Symbolism, and Transcendentalism shaped the artist's worldview and offered him a provisional grammar through which to translate his expansive collection of materials seen in his workshop on the left into discrete objects. This chapter also places Cornell's work in the context of the efflorescence of interest in symbolism and transcendentalism during the 1920s in the work of artists like Arthur Dove, Paul Strand, and Charles Sheeler, and Alfred Stieglitz, to show how for these artists, enchantment offered a critique of, rather than a capitulation to, capitalist modernity's cult of individualism and material acquisition. In this and the subsequent chapter, I examine Cornell's role in Surrealism's earliest presentations in the United States at Julian Levy Gallery and the Museum of Modern Art. By combining Surrealist theories of automatism with an emphasis on amateurism, seen in the work of children or so-called folk art, institutions such as MoMA attempted to answer the demotic imperative of the 1930s through evaluation of vernacular or amateur artistic production. The competing pressures of public accessibility and the enshrinement of vanguard art gave rise not only to important exhibitions such as MoMA's Fantastic Art Dada Surrealism, installation views of which you see on the right, but also to Cornell's vaunted box format. Soap Bubble Set, Cornell's first box construction, created specifically for inclusion in Fantastic Art Dada Surrealism, invokes a distinguished lineage of works that use translucent spheres to materialize moments of faith and doubt. The edges of his box and the grid which arranges its objects is like Rosalind Krauss's grid as symbolist window, creating a cosmos in which modernity's pretension to rationalism and its lingering investment in illusionism are held in suspension, if only for a moment. With the rise of totalitarianism in the late 1930s, enchantment increasingly came to be viewed as a tool of fascistic or capitalistic social control, appearing to align with the pernicious effects of propaganda or commercial culture. Despite its denigration, enchantment transformed and persisted in the work of artists, poets, and writers such as Charles Henry Ford and Parker Tyler. My third chapter considers Cornell's graphic design work for their Surrealist publication View, as well as his contributions to Lincoln Kirstein's Dance Index, which I'll be talking a bit about later in this talk, to show how the artist's enchantment shaped these figures' approach to myth as a site of non-contradictory truth, a place in which the fantastic can be true, to create an imagined origin for queer desire. Chapter 4 probes the limits of Cornell's universalizing view of enchantment by exploring the entanglement of idealization and objectification in his approach to women as enchantresses. And my final chapter addresses what I describe as the lyric turn of art and poetry in the 1950s. Lyric poetry's emphasis on subjective experience offered a means to scale down the grand ambitions of the pre-war decades, recasting enchantment as intimate and interpersonal as birdsong. An extended epilogue examines Cornell's enduring relevance to post-war American art through the lens of artists including Robert Rauschenberg, Betty Saar, and Carolee Schneemann, all of whom grappled with his example. Their work suggests enchantment's enduring relevance to the artistic and social aims of post-war American art. As this historical overview suggests, enchantment is neither inherently emancipatory nor inherently authoritarian, but rather can be put to a variety of uses. Cornell struggled to articulate the character of the world's intangible power, to convey it in material form, to communicate it, and to maintain his belief amidst the horrific conflagrations of the 20th century. These questions were not circumscribed to the realm of fine art. Rather, they were deeply felt inquiries about the relationship between art, imagination, and the real, the pain and impossibility of desire and creation, the ethical stakes of making art in the midst of violence and suffering, and the possibility of what is described as what has been described as human fullness, or a sense of meaning and purpose beyond instrumental rationality. Although I am not religious, these questions resonate deeply with me. Cornell sought hope in a hopeless world. I can think of no more consequential question to consider at this moment. So the remainder of this talk is drawn from the 3rd chapter of my book. In this section on Dance Index, I examine Cornell's contribution to the burgeoning culture of ballet in the United States, and specifically ballet's shift from a folkloric populism in the 1930s to the inviolable classicism of the 1940s. In 1946, Cornell guest edited a special issue of the periodical Dance Index titled Clowns, Elephants, and Ballerinas. Cornell's cover design shows the white steed of Georges Seurat's painting Le Cirque galloping through a paper screen. To achieve this cheeky trompe-l'oeil effect, Cornell placed a reproduction of Seurat's painting behind a sheet of torn paper and commissioned the photographer Larry Caldwell to take a picture of the arrangement. The result is an homage to both Seurat and to Charlie Chaplin, whose 1928 silent film The Circus opens with an acrobat bursting through the black title card. In the next shot, a blur of white streaks across the screen as a horse canters past the rip in the barrier. Cornell's cover compresses and freezes Chaplin's opening scene into a single image, just as Seurat's painting suspends its acrobats midair. Exaggerated shadows cast by the screen's torn edges and the horse's forelegs augment the cover's trompe-l'oeil effect. Suspended mid-stride, the horse leaps the barrier between the illusionistic space of Seurat's painting and the outside world. With this cover, Cornell proposes that the rarefied realm of ballet and the popular entertainment of the cinema and the circus are not as far apart as they may appear. As the artist writes in the issue, the 2 pages of the layout of which you see at right, quote, "Clowns do not always dance, but essentially they were trained as dancers. Their hands, feet, their whole bodies express themselves as precisely as dancers." Enchantment, Cornell suggests in this issue, is not the province of a single sphere of culture, but cuts across the fine and vernacular, the elevated and the lowly. Dance Index was the cornerstone of impresario Lincoln Kirstein's attempt to cement dance's place in American culture. In 1933, Kirstein partnered with former Ballet Russe choreographer George Balanchine to found the School of American Ballet. The folkloric themes of these early ballets from the 1930s, such as Billy the Kid or Filling Station, based on the adventures of Mac, the gas station attendant, were connected to the leftist politics of the 1930s, and particularly the question of how to cultivate a broad audience for purportedly elitist art forms. Kirstein believed that infusing ballet with American vernacular sources would help modernize and popularize it, reflecting in his 1937 pamphlet blast with ballet, quote, "I still think that given half a chance, ballet, even by Americans, would please an opera house audience if the atmosphere were a trace less snobbish." In Cornell, Kirstein found a designer uniquely positioned to visualize Dan's Index's ethos of scholarly accessibility. At the time of the publication's founding, the artist was already an amateur scholar of ballet, attending performances regularly during the 20s and 30s, and amassing a vast trove of ballet-related ephemera, an example of which you see on the screen in front of you. Over the course of the publication's 6-year run, Cornell designed 14 covers, a selection of which you see on the screen, and guest edited 4 special issues, drawing on both his personal collection and MoMA's newly established dance archives. The artist's centrality to the publication's visual identity was such that he was the only graphic designer the magazine credited by name. Cornell approached each issue as he would a work of art, explaining to Kirstein that a single special issue consumed 9 months to a year, requiring, quote, "endless research, chasing around in exultations of going to press." In the same letter, he noted that these exertions were so great that they caused his own artistic output to dramatically decrease. In ballet, the artist found a subject particularly well suited to his attempts to convey enchantment. And these are 2 works that I discuss in a subsequent chapter. So from its origins in Neoplatonic philosophy of the 16th century, ballet attempted to mediate the divide between the metaphysical and the material. Ballet's rigid repertoire of steps and poses were created to convey a higher spiritual order through the bodies of its dancers. Romantic ballet, the 19th century form Cornell cherished most, pushed this dematerialization of the body to its logical conclusion by establishing the conventions that we associate with classical ballet today: the delicate dancing in point, tulle tutus, gravity-defying leaps, innovations intended to create the illusion of the human body unencumbered by earthly forces such as gravity or mass. Through Dance Index, Cornell found a circle that shared his intense devotion to ballet and moreover respected his approach to it. In Kirstein's foreword to Clowns, Elephants, and Ballerinas, he astutely observed, quote, "For Cornell, the inconsequential past is neither frivolous nor dead." Kirstein continued, "Cornell is brother to the scientist who recreated a whole prehistoric age from the glimpse of a dinosaur tooth. From a fragment of a program, a set of lithographs, a couple of footnotes, and a reference in a letter, Mr. Cornell evokes splendid evenings completely lost." Kirstein's statement suggests Cornell's relevance to Dance Index's attempts to broaden an audience for ballet. Cornell's enchantment allowed him to find value in a range of culture, from the Ballet Russe to Philip Astley's 19th century spectacles. His broad yet exacting taste accorded with the publication's editorial program, which included issues on romantic ballet as well as shaker dance, dance films, and even the specialized topic of European dance teachers in the United States. For both Kirstein and Balanchine, vernacular forms were crucial to leavening what they described as the Ballet Russe's outmoded European decadence. For example, in 1942, Balanchine choreographed the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey's Circus's Elephant Ballet, which featured 50 tutued pachyderms adorned with garlands of roses and apple blossoms, dancing along corps de ballet to music by Igor Stravinsky. The Elephant Ballet was the subject of the only original content in Clowns, Elephants, and Ballerinas, an essay by the poet Marianne Moore that Kirstein described as a defense of the elephant as dancer. Moore praised Balanchine's choreography for highlighting the elephant's innate grace, observing, quote, their deliberate way of kneeling on slow sliding forelegs, like a cat's yawning stretch or a ship's slide into water, is fine ballet. Moore's discussion of the elephant as dancer also offered Cornell a potent opening to connect his enchantment with the aims of Dance Index. As the artist wrote in the issue, quote, the elephant has become a kind of dialectical symbol for theatrical dancing, its huge gray bulk the opposite of the flashing ballerina's mercurial evanescence. There is enchantment to be found even in the heaviest of creatures, provided we are willing to see beyond mere appearances. Yet from its debut issue, whose Cornell designed cover is on the screen, which was published in 1942, January of 1942, Dance Index was indelibly marked by the Second World War. In their opening comment, co-editors Bearded Hastings, Paul Magriel, and Kirstein explained that they had planned the issue before Pearl Harbor and printed it soon thereafter. They were preparing to halt production when they were contacted by, quote, a number of men in service who expressed a lively interest in the magazine, and this, if nothing else, convinced us to persevere. The only note of solace in their text is what they describe as dance's persistence in Western culture. Quote, like other arts, dancing has survived every disaster the Western world has known. It seems to exist instinctively in response to some blind necessity, which in an almost preposterous sense ignores all the frightening facts of human survival. Cornell's cover design offers an apt visual corollary to this discussion of cultural survival. Its star as the dancer is Dora Duncan, revered for her deployment of classical sources as well as her innovative choreographic grammar. To visualize Duncan's classical inheritance, Cornell arranged photographs, reviews, and dance programs into a montage that spills beyond the graphic outlines of an amphora. Duncan looks out from the montage's center, clad in a draped garment trimmed with a Greek meander pattern and wearing her hair in a Hellenistic coiffure. She sits atop columnar forms built from newspaper clippings, with the headline La Danse Grecque Antique and a photograph of women arrayed before a classical frieze. Cornell flanks her with images from Renaissance painting, including the three graces of Botticelli's La Primavera at right, and a striding figure trailed by the loop of drapery at left. The figure in motion is none other than Abby Warburg's time-traveling nympha, her presence reverberating through antiquity, Renaissance, and the present. Although there is no evidence that Cornell knew of Warburg's work, Nympha's presence in this collage is no coincidence. The German art historian famously attended performances by Duncan while developing his theory of pathos formel. The servicemen who clamored for Dance Index's publication had already begun to leave for war by the time it was printed, and the editors Kirstein, Magriel, and Hastings would soon join them. From 1942 through 45, Dance Index's introductory section inadvertently tracked the circulation of bodies, diligently noting the magazine's personnel changes as the war pulled ever more men into its brutal orbit. The experience of war had a decisive impact on Kirstein, attuning him to the vulnerability of the human body. Kirstein spent part of the war as a member of the famed Monuments Division, rescuing Europe's cultural patrimony from destruction. The war's toll registered most profoundly for Kirstein when he came across the dancer Lou Christensen burying bodies as a member of the Graves Registration Agency, his honed dancer's muscles repurposed for physical labor. Christensen was revered by Balanchine and Kirstein, who called him an Orpheus and Apollo for America, an American hero with the technique of an Olympian. The war brought the god back down to earth. As Kirstein later wrote, quote, nothing is more frail or transient than a ballet. Every action is evanescent, and after its enactment, it is gone for good or until a next time when the same conditions obtain. Human bodies are frail. After the war, Kirstein channeled this concern with the fragility of the human body into championing the Polish Jewish sculptor Ali Nadelman, who committed suicide in 1946. Nadelman lost numerous family members to the concentration camps, and his suicide was the horrific culmination of a decade of struggles, including financial ruin and a worsening heart condition. During the 1940s, the artist abandoned the sensuous wood and marble sculptures he had produced in the 1920s in favor of small handmade figures sculpted from plastine clay, whose voluminous forms were inspired by Cupid dolls, Mae West, and Greek terracotta votives. These intimate sculptures bear the traces of Nadelman's fingers as he pinched and smoothed their delicate bodies. Rather than preserving them under an electrolyte coating, Nadelman left them to dry in the air, vulnerable to the ravages of light and time. Within a week of Nadelman's suicide, Kirstein began work on a lifelong project to preserve the sculptor's legacy. In the catalog for Nadelman's 1948 retrospective, he writes of visiting the artist's studio in the winter of 1947 after his death and seeing, quote, dozens of these small white corpses laid out as if one had stumbled upon archaeological treasures, relics of a hecatomb or mass sacrifice, suggesting the intense emotional charge of his posthumous championing of the artist. He attempted to preserve these vulnerable lumps of clay by recasting them into durable materials such as bronze or marble, as if to save Nadelman's legacy from further decay. Kirstein's most ambitious intervention involved overseeing the casting of two of the artist's papier-mâché figures into pristine Carrara marble. These were installed, they're colossal 19-foot sculptures at either end of the newly built New York State Theater at Lincoln Center, where you can still see them today. Their swollen limbs and polished surfaces exhibit none of the fragile intimacy of their predecessors. This was precisely the point. By remaking them in the most vaunted of classical materials, Kirstein rendered Nadelman's sculptures impervious to time and destruction. These figures embody Kirstein's wish to make culture, the bodies that created them, whole and enduring, fixing time's flow into static eternity. Cornell responded to the war in his own ways. Habitat for a Shooting Gallery from 1943 made its public debut at Julian Levy's exhibition Through the Big End of the Opera Glass, alongside an array of small objects by Yves Tanguy and Marcel Duchamp. Reviewing the show, New York Times art critic Edward Allen Jewell criticized Cornell for his perceived escapism. Quote, Cornell's art I shall have to leave altogether, I'm afraid, in the reader's hands, but handle with care, for it is fragile. Somehow, while looking with curiosity at his neat little bottles filled with this and that, his pretty shells and devious gadgets and the doll enmeshed in silvered twigs, I remembered that there is a war. And after that, try as I might, I couldn't find my way back into Mr. Cornell's dream world. Jewell's commentary is emblematic of the questions asked of art during times of turmoil and tragedy. What is it for, and what good does it do in the world? Habitat Group for a Shooting Gallery suggests that Cornell asked himself these very questions. The work is among the most literal in his oeuvre. A single hole pierces its glass front, as if a bullet has ripped through the box to splatter the primary colored blood of Cornell's beloved birds across its interior. The work of art is an abattoir. A vulgar bloom of red paint crowns the cranium of the central cockatoo. Feathers, bullet holes, blood, all attempt to depict the violence of the war. But the cost of this little engagement with the historical moment was a reduction of Cornell's avian characters to corporeal bodies. 2 years later, Cornell took an altogether different approach to bring current events into his work. In September of 1945, Dance Index published the artist special issue devoted to Danish author Hans Christian Andersen. In the issue's foreword, Cornell connected Andersen to the war's conclusion. Quote, "The constant tin soldier has been through more fiery trials, and the little match girl more long, cruel winters. Rejoicing with them in the liberation of the land that gave them birth, we can better appreciate the imponderables of the tales, to survive the terror and tragedy that have been their lot the past half-decade. Perennial and universal has been their appeal. Renewed acquaintance with them now becomes even more rewarding." Despite its celebratory tone, Cornell's choice of tales is telling. At their end, the tin soldier is melted down into a metal heart, and the little match girl freezes to death. Just 5 months earlier, Denmark had been liberated from the Nazis. The issue is illustrated by paper silhouettes created by Andersen, which Cornell had borrowed from Copenhagen's Hans Christian Andersen Museum. The frontispiece features a ballet dancer balancing delicately on pointed toes. To create her perfectly symmetrical figure, Andersen folded a piece of paper and snipped along its central crease, layering this ornate black web on a sheet of white paper. She is the tin soldier's beloved, the paper ballerina who falls into the flames and is incinerated into ash. Cornell wrote that he admired Andersen's fairy tales for, quote, "their release, their escape, their flight, and their defiance of the limitations of the physical world, their amiability, the subtler sense of light and air." This is what Cornell means when he describes the imponderables of the tales. Yet if enchantment endures, it neither reverses the tale's tragic endings nor the war's violence. In contrast to the literalism of Habitat for Shooting Gallery, as well as Kirstein's classicism, which attempted to fix and preserve in the face of incomprehensible violence, here Cornell neither depicts nor attempts to forestall the brutality. Rather, tragedy makes the survival of Andersen's tales all the more miraculous. Andersen's stories, Cornell's enchantment, cannot repair violence and death. Their continued existence, even in the face of the world's brutality, is the miracle. This is the source of their limited strength. So by way of conclusion, I'd like to jump forward about a decade and a half to consider the work of Carolee Schneemann, who at once extended and critiqued Cornell's enchantment. Around 1956, Schneemann contacted Joseph Cornell at the suggestion of filmmaker Stan Brakhage. Schneemann arrived at Cornell's home on Utopia Parkway wearing a modest dress and ballet slippers, a costume suggested by the other young women hired to assist the artist during the last decades of his life. Cornell, she recalled, preferred that his female assistants assume a, quote, "innocent guise." An ardent and outspoken feminist, Schneemann at once recognized the troublesome dimensions of Cornell's view of women, but also found in them a curious sense of freedom. Entering into his world meant, quote, leaving, quote, "the terrible exigencies and orders of a corrupt civilization, and spending hours pondering the slowest gesture and thinnest glass shining mica in a paving stone." And those are Schneemann's words. These experiences made a deep impression on the young artist. To be with Cornell, she noted, was to be, quote, "enchanted in a banal, ordinary, daily sort of way." She credited Cornell for helping her experience these forces, yet Schneemann also intuited there were forces Cornell would not touch. The artist, she recalled, lived in, quote, a great terror of his sexuality, a repression that she understood as a quote, source of immense creative suppressed exploration. Schneemann seemed determined to unleash all that Cornell wished to repress. Icebox from 1963 looks like a Cornell box after a car crash. Twisted steel weaves among chaotic splashes of paint, twigs, and other detritus, while broken glass dangles from the box's frame. The work's wrecked, interpenetrating forms subject the structured order of Cornell's carefully cultivated enchantment to unruly destructive forces of the outside world. Schneemann makes this idea explicit in her Controlled Burning series. Hinged boxes packed with fragments of glass, mirror, paint, and cloth are doused with turpentine and touched with a lit match before the lid is closed. Schneemann's procedure relinquishes control over the creative process to the fire, which burns until the box's limited oxygen runs out. Such ideas were extended into rooms and the human body in performances such as Meet Joy, in which Schneemann's body at once responds to and orchestrates the world around it, a feminist rejoinder to the masculist impulse of containment and control. In Meet Joy's orgiastic tumbling of bodies amidst raw fish, chicken, sausages, and paint, Schneemann locates an energy that was at once, quote, sensual, cosmic, joyous, and repellent. In contrast to Cornell's work, Schneemann's Dionysian enchantment arises from the erotic energy of the body and the sensuous power of the materials themselves, rather than from an external force. When Schneemann told Cornell about Meet Joy, she actually wrote him, she withheld the exact details of the performance, fearing they would upset him. But eventually she did tell him. On March 20th, 1976, just after Cornell's death, she performed a work she described as, quote, another sort of box for and about just Cornell at the Anthology Film Archives in New York. And you see the performance score on your screen in front of you. She called the performance Moon in a Tree, a friendship and artifacts of Joseph Cornell, a phrase that came to her in a dream. Art historian Joanna Roche has noted that the tree evokes the quince tree in the backyard of Cornell's home, as well as Cornell himself. Schneemann is the moon. Carolee Schneemann steps onto a dark stage. She wears a modest vintage dress and ballet flats, the same costume she donned to visit Cornell. She takes a seat in one of two empty chairs. She sips pink lemonade spiked with vodka, the drink Cornell served her during her visits, albeit without the alcohol. 3 screens projected images from 3 separate side carousels form the stage's backdrop. The left screen shows images of Schneemann's life and work, while the one at right shows Cornell's work. In the middle, Schneemann projects selections from their decade-long correspondence. The performance begins with the click of an advancing slide. An early painting by Schneemann appears with a photograph of Cornell. Click. The artist typed directions to his home, flanked by a photograph of Schneemann and Cornell. That's not them, but it's a stand-in. And Cornell's box, Grand Hotel Bonport. As she advances the slide, Schneemann reads excerpts from their letters and offers personal anecdotes and observations. Click, click, click. A photograph of the performance eye body appears next to Untitled Butterfly Habitat from 1940. And soon thereafter, Schneemann poignantly shows an image of Meet Joy alongside a scene from Cornell's 1957 film Angel. The raw flesh and erotic intensity of the performance embodies all that is repressed in Cornell's austere stone figure, while also perhaps suggesting their connection. The performance was Schneemann's way of saying all that remained unsaid between them. It was also a gift. Through the intermediary of their correspondence in Schneemann's voice, works that would seem diametrically opposed in tenor and aim come into contact. The slide projector creates a montage in which the connections and disjunctures among Cornell's and Schneemann's work emerge. Meat and stone, bodies and sculpture, profane and sacred, flow together yet remain apart. The montage extends to the realms of the living and the dead, for Schneemann sits across an empty chair reserved for Cornell. She feels the audience slip away. She begins to speak directly to him. He is at once present and absent. She enters Cornell's world for the last time, but finally brings her full self into it. Quote, I understood I might contribute to an enchantment, and was myself inspired by Joseph's deep connection to the gift of creating vision, the subtle immediacy of things observed and resonant for his, quote, visioning state, his rich metaphoric erudition. In the end, the artist shared a conviction in the specialness of the everyday and the importance of looking and feeling deeply. In a recent remembrance of Schneemann, writer Maggie Nelson poses two questions first asked by Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. What do we have that we want to keep? And what do we not have that we need? Nelson finds the answer to both questions in this statement from Schneemann written when she was 18. Quote, that is all I want, re-enchantment. It is something I must do myself. What do we want to keep? What do we have? What do we not have that we need? And to these, I would add another question. What do we have that we do not need? Schneemann did not need Cornell's desire for control, order, and preservation, and his limited vision of women. But she kept his deep appreciation for the power of the quotidian and his knowledge that there are many ways of being in the world. I too want to keep these things. Cornell has shown me a richer, more complicated version of some stories I thought I knew. He also told me stories I had never heard before, and others he likely did not intend to share. He taught me about the magic of figuration and its ability to conjure worlds from humble things. In a certain light, with some imagination, chips of glass can become diamonds. And in his work, I recognize the pain of realizing that no one can fully grasp another's experience of the world. I find these lessons beautiful and meaningful, so I choose to keep them. I also choose to keep the wisdom that certain things cannot be explained in instrumental terms. And above all, I choose to keep the knowledge that meaning resides in the world around us rather than in some distant realm. The smallest things are often the most consequential. Perhaps enchantment is not some lost cosmic unity, some long departed force, but simply a recognition of that which has been with us all along. Thank you.
Thank you, Marci. You know, that last, those questions at the end that you asked via Maggie Nelson are very suggestive. And I think that they may inform some of the questions that we hear from members of our audience, because the whole kind of question, what do we have that we want to keep? What do we not have that we need? All those kinds of questions, I think, are really at the center of your project. And I hope that the audience will want to bring out some of those in our conversation. So we have a big audience in North America. We have a coast-to-coast audience, and then internationally we have viewers right now from Israel and Brazil and other places. An audience of about 150 people. Let me remind the people viewing that if you want to submit a question to Marci Kwon, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to pose most of the questions that we get, if we can, in the time that remains. We'll finish a little bit before 12:30. Marci, I want to start by asking you about the origins of the project. How did you discover not only Cornell's work in this rich context, but also how did you come to the organizing it around the concept of enchantment?
Yeah, thank you for that. So there are multiple answers to this question. One is that, I first saw his work when I was a sophomore at the Museum of Modern Art when it had just reopened, and it really struck me, but it seems so out of joint with the works that surrounded it. Um, and then when I was kind of thinking about, you know, what I was interested in, this started off as a dissertation project. I've always really been drawn to artists, figures that would seem to fall outside of serious consideration. I have a pretty broad range of interests, of academic interests, but I would say they're all held together by the sense that they're kind of in this liminal position. And I really believe that it's those figures that tell us the most about the prevailing assumptions, desires, and fears of a cultural moment. And so Cornell was someone that allowed me to think about this, and also because of the kind of scope of his career, think about a kind of rather unusual slice of time in the historiography of American art. So the book ranges from the 1920s to the 60s, and usually you see a kind of hard break at the 1940s into pre and post-war art. But for me, this idea of enchantment allowed me to kind of rethink that break and think about it in terms of, the types of cultural imperatives that were emerging, and that were both connecting as well as kind of splitting apart the 30s and the 40s, for example. And then just upon actually deciding, that I wanted to work on Cornell, I would say one of the biggest things for me was reading an essay that's frequently cited by Eve Sedgwick on paranoid and reparative reading. And where she's talking about like this prevailing academic impulse to just demystify, get to the truth, get to the bottom of something. And I don't think she's not like fully turning against critique. She understands its importance, but I also think that, at the end of that essay, she asks, like, what do we do with artists? And she just names a litany of artists that were really important to me, Jack Smith, as well as Cornell, who are kind of working outside of this paradigm, who are trying to find a way of kind of putting together a world that seems determined not to have them. And that was when I was like, right, this is the person for me. This is the artist for me.
Do you think that I'd love to hear you elaborate a little bit on how what you're calling a kind of reparative approach, and maybe we should say something about what that is for people that may not be that familiar with it, how that led you to enchantment specifically. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah.
I see a very organic connection there, but I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, the idea of reparative comes from these various positions from the psychoanalyst Melanie Klein, who's thinking about the different positions of infanthood and kind of stages of development. And, the paranoid schizoid position is one where you're kind of constantly, it's, I think, very familiar to me. It's like a kind of anxious position, right? Where you're constantly thinking you're under attack in a way, and then trying to like excavate the answer. And reparative, when I went back to this essay, in starting the book Manuscript and went back to Klein's work, I realized that, it's not this perfect return to an imagined like utopian origin, but it's just a way of kind of building something like out of the world. And I think that, and also accepting, the imperfection, the cruelty, the fact that you don't have control over the world, right? It's about that kind of acceptance. And so I think with Cornell with something like Enchantment, I think you're right that it's more of an intuitive, organic connection where, I think that one Cornell, that's how he related to these various objects is, in kind of assembling a world, even from things that would seem outmoded. But I also think that it's about like an acceptance of limitations,
Mm-hmm.
an acceptance of the
Mm-hmm.
limitations of what we can actually know, like know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's
Okay,
what I
so
see kind of connecting those two ideas.
I see. Okay, so now I think it's the moment to ask one of our viewers' questions, which is a very fundamental question. And I know many people will have this on their minds. I had a version of this question on my mind during the talk. Could you elaborate on the relation between enchantment and the system you're working, the program you're working with in your argument, between enchantment and modernism, which has so often been treated as a disenchanted, obviously it's modernism is many things in different times and places, but for a long time, it was thought of as obviously as something fundamentally disenchanted. Could you talk
Right.
about the relation between your modernism for the purposes of this project and that concept?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I take a really expansive view of modernism in the book, which is just, it's cultural response to modernity, right?
Sure.
And I think that there are a few ways of answering this question. One is within an art historical context. Actually, modernism is often understood as disenchantment. I think, and I think that, it's something it's kind of shared. Key critics such as Rosalind Krauss is saying that, there is now in modernity, or I would say that this idea of enchantment or modernity as disenchanted is taken as axiomatic, right? Rosalind Krauss says now there's like an absolute split between art and spirit. And so now we find, the idea
Right.
of spirit, which had been so important in art, indescribably embarrassing. And so it's that kind of, I would say, epistemological assumption that a lot of the foundational constructs of art historical modernism are based. And then what I would also say is that, you know, there are this project in Cornell allowed me to bring kind of other cultural spheres into contact with, this idea of art historical modernism in order to, which is often also like, described very historically in terms of someone like Clement Greenberg's work as, self-reflexive, as Kantian, as this kind, yeah, like, I mean, Clement Greenberg's philosophy is coming from, I think, like, an Enlightenment idea that you like kind of self-reflect and then find the limitations of something. And then, and so I would say that this idea is really opposed to that kind of formulation. But what, yeah, like kind of bringing in different cultural spheres, something like ballet, which again might seem like a continuation of the 19th century. When you actually look at the cultural forms ballet were taking in the early 20th century in the United States, it's actually in dialogue with the politics, that folkloric dimension, of like having someone like having a ballet of Billy the Kid, for example, is exactly in line with the kind of cultural imperatives of the 1930s, brought about by the Great Depression. And so that's another thing I would say is that it's, they're all kind of connected to the kind of historical moment. And then, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Do you think, I wonder if you would accept or disavow something like the following, that you are, I know this isn't the thrust of the project, but I'm wondering if I could put a spin on it and ask you to comment.
Yeah.
Are you documenting, by widening the scope of what you consider modernism for the purposes of this project, and as you said, going back to Sedgwick's list of figures, sort of welcoming in a whole lot of people that were, let's just say, a little harder to talk about under the prevailing paradigms of the way people talked about modernism for a long time, by widening the scope of what you're bringing into this book, are you in fact documenting a kind of counter tradition or a kind of split within this very multifarious thing called modernism, in which, now people, for your purposes, surrealism, some of the people you mentioned, surrealism, Mina Loy, Marianne Moore, and of course, the central figures in your project represent a kind of enchanted space within the larger modernist tradition. Whereas I can imagine you might say there are other figures who are unequivocally modernist, let's say Marinetti, who would be very hard to relate to enchantment. Mm-hmm. So is there a kind of split there that you're documenting, and is that a helpful way to think about what you're doing?
That's really helpful. Thank you. I mean, I think that so Mina Loy was actually a Christian Scientist as well. She's the mother-in-law of Julian Levy, who's Cornell's first dealer. So that's how they got to know each other. And I would say, like, yes, I suppose I'm what you describe is true, but I guess I'm less interested in being like, or I guess widening the scope is true, but I think I'm less interested in like, or the stakes of the project are less about like a kind of term like modernism, even though it's in the title. It's a helpful phrase for thinking about like the kinds of traditions or the types of work I'm interested in, and it's more about like who is considered within or outside of modernity, and what that idea does to our sense of evaluation of intelligence, of propriety, and I think that like so I would say that certainly what you're describing is like a thrust of the book, but again, like for me it's less about terms and more about like this question of what has the kind of prevailing structure allowed us to take seriously or not.
I get that. I mean, you're not telling the whole story of modernism. Yeah. You're talking about a set of figures in relation to modernity who strike different positions in relation to that, and use in various ways use enchantment as kind of leverage on that problem. That's very interesting. Yeah. Here's a question from one of your fellows this year at the Humanities Center. The question is, how might Cornell's enchantment be in conversation with circulations of the Orient and the Oriental through the early part of the 20th century? The question goes on. Isadora Duncan, Balanchine, and modern American dance have been revealed to be in deep debt to cultural forms in Asia and Africa, as has European modernism in general. Through Emersonian ideas of transcendence to modernist engagements with decoration, is there a transnational way to read Cornell's articulation of enchantment?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So the elephant ballet that I showed, I couldn't get like really deeply into it, but especially, even the dancer, Vanessa, is described as Hindu. And in fact, in the special issue and I do talk about this in the book, in the special issue, Cornell is placing the elephant ballet in dialogue with a flyer for precisely an Orientalist spectacle called the Elephants of Siam, which was produced in like the 1830s in Paris. And so he's drawing a direct line between those things. And certainly, the question of the non-Western or the Oriental is really complicated in my book, because, on one hand, Cornell is, operating very directly from a Christian tradition. So I'm like in no way positing this version of enchantment as like some emancipatory, like anti-Western thing. And on the other hand, there's a way in which a kind of fear of enchantment, as a kind of construct, not just a kind of transcendental idea that's like coming out of a kind of Western Christian tradition, but like as like having like objects invested with power, for example, in terms of the fetish. That is actually a kind of key aspect of Orientalism, as well as like people like William Pates has shown, right? It's like this idea that you can have materials invested with a kind of power. So I would say that enchantment actually, as I'm using it, has these different dimensions to it. And I do think that the idea of enchantment, for example, for an artist of color like Betty Saar that I talk about is really complicated because on one hand, the idea of, like an artist of color having a kind of natural connection to the spiritual is its own form of kind of primitivism, and which we've seen in historical exhibitions in the Museum of Modern Art. But on the other hand, I think that artists who have those investments are also often understood as being anti-modern and being outside of modernity, because as if those convictions can exist within modernity. So I would say it's a complicated dimension of like this kind of theoretical construct that I'm thinking about.
On behalf of another one of our audience members, I want to ask you to pick up on that concept of power that you just mentioned, because this person wants you to elaborate, but asks an important follow-up question, I think, to what you just said, which is in the relation between enchantment and power, where does the transformative power truly reside? How can it be transferred or bequeathed?
Well, I would say that for me, it's not about enchantment like having its own inherent power, but it's about what I'm interested in the book is how people have approached it, right? And so for example, in the 30s, something like enchantment, and I'm talking about it through surrealism, like offers a critique of modernity, right? Often offers a critique of the kind of hyper kind of rationalistic, capitalistic social world. And so in the United States, like this idea actually gets picked up and then used to in a kind of, I would say, domestic primitivism, like used to suggest surrealism's relevance to all of daily life. So, as a means of trying to show that art can be for everyone. And so in the 30s, for example, something like surrealism is like understood as being like a kind of inherent part of daily life. And that's what the Fantastic Art Data Surrealism exhibition is like really trying to bring out. That exhibition has like 730 objects that are drawn from like animation, from design, so on and so forth. And so in the 40s, and of course, as I mentioned, with this like with the kind of growing fear of propaganda, and with something like Clement Greenberg's avant-garde and kitsch, you begin to have a fear of this type of power as a means of kind of mass control. And that's not just in art history. We can think of someone like Emile Durkheim's idea of like collective effervescence, right? And so I think that, so I think it's, again, for me, it's less about positing that enchantment has some inherent transformative power and more about like understanding how that has been understood historically.
Good. And on behalf of both the audience member and me, thank you, because that does clarify things quite a bit. Let me ask you a couple of questions about Cornell that have come in specifically about Cornell. One asks, I'm curious to hear more about the affordances of the form of the box in Cornell's work. Is there something about that hermetically sealedness that allows him to capture these fleeting moments of fullness that you mentioned?
Yeah, so there's a kind of there's a whole chapter on this, so I could talk about this for a long time. But I think that there's a couple of things. One is that the box seems hermetically sealed, but it has a reflective front. And there actually is always this dimension of participation in Cornell's work. So like when I went to like a collector's house to examine some of the boxes, he's like, here, pick it up. And that's actually how Cornell intended a lot of them to be used, is like to be actually picked up and like shaked, like so you can like hear them and feel them. And the glass is actually all about, it is all about contingency in a way, these reflections that are constantly kind of flashing in and out of the surface. And then the box also, I think, allowed him to create a syntax for, an array of different materials, right? So a syntax that is setting him apart from other so-called amateurs, in which he was in dialogue with, and actually showed in Fantastic Art Dot and Surrealism. So it allows, for example, him to activate plays of scale. So in a box format, you can put like a small egg next to a giant moon and suggest a kind of large expanse of space, for example, without them just like being objects next to each other as an assemblage. So I think that it allowed him to create a syntax on different objects, and also while also kind of having a degree of contingency embedded into the structure.
Another question is, could you say something about how your work on Cornell contributes to our understanding of collage writ large?
Yeah, so it's interesting that because, as I mentioned, Cornell actually always called his collages montages. So collage just being, the procedure of pasting papers next to each other. But he was not only a kind of avid cinephile, he was a collector of films and or maker of films. And I think that this idea of montage, and the idea that there's both a connection and a disjuncture implied by the cut. That's something that my colleague Pavlo Levy has kind of described in great depth. That is, I think, what he's interested in the work. And so again, it's this kind of tension. It's always this kind of paradox or tension that he's interested in, that he's engaging in his work and trying to kind of embody in material form.
We have a couple of questions about the relation between Cornell and Carolee Schneemann, who you talked about at the end of the talk. And let me see if I can get those in, because we just have about a little less than, a little more than 5 minutes left. First of all, could you say something about what's known about Cornell's reaction to her work, including any acknowledgement of her apparent deliberate engagement with and critique of his work?
Yeah, so they were, so there is actually a degree, like there's correspondence that exists between them, as well as Stanford actually holds part of the Carolee Schneemann papers. And so I was able to conduct research there. She always wrote him about her work, as I mentioned, but she was excising certain aspects of it. So Meet Joy, she just like says that she does this performance, but she doesn't actually mention, that she's like tumbling around with like raw chicken. And I think that that's pretty characteristic of their relationship. She understood that there were things that she could bring into that relationship and things that she didn't. And she tried to, she never pushed those boundaries so much. And I don't think that, and in terms of his knowledge of her work, like, the icebox work, I haven't found any like evidence that he knew of that work. But he was very encouraging to her. And there was a period of kind of intensive correspondence for a decade, and then it kind of petered out.
And maybe this will be one of the last questions. Obviously, Schneemann survived him by a long time. Cornell died, what, in the early 70s, something like that? And she lived until what, 2 years ago? Something like that, very recently.
Yeah.
What happens in that period in her career? In terms of the relation to Cornell? Could you say a little more about that?
I mean, she's just an incredible, prolific artist, and is like keeps on, making. And I want to be really clear. I'm not like saying that she's taking like all of her ideas from Cornell. She's a filmmaker as well. She's making all of these. She's really like a kind of singular figure who's drawing from so many different sources. Cornell was just one source that she drew from, and so in her subsequent work, she's, I would say that, what I see kind of most intensively is the kind of interest and the ability to just move across media and to work and to understand that it's not about like the kind of bounded genre, but it's about like the kind of convictions behind them. And I think that that's really kind of what she's taking from his practice. But again, it's not to over determine that relationship or his influence on her work.
Are there other relationships, artistic relationships that sort of, the aftermath of Cornell's influence of more recent artists that we should be looking at besides Schneemann?
I mean, there's so many. I mean, I talk about 3 in the book. Betty Saar, who actually sees a show of Cornell's in Pasadena, and Robert Rauschenberg, who was like actually like going employed by Charles Egan Gallery when he was a young artist in New York and like was the only person with a driver's license at the gallery. So like had to drive to Cornell's like house to pick up his work. But he was, there are so many, like Ken Price is making boxes at Los Angeles artist, Wallace Berman. There are all of these artists in California in particular who are picking up View, which was that surrealist publication that I was talking about, and like really, engaging with it. And I would say that, the kind of aftermath of surrealism, or, a kind of American surrealism that Cornell is embodying, becomes very influential in California in the 60s and the 70s, and actually intertwined with the counterculture, which goes to this, again, like idea of both enchantment and Orientalism that was talked about earlier. And then, just like recently, I would say that there are just so many artists who seem, to be interested in his form. One that I was actually in conversation with was the one who did the, really remarkable Melancholy Museum that's currently at the Cantor Arts Center, who's Mark Dion, who is really interested in forms of display in, 16th through 19th century forms of display in cabinets. And Cornell is certainly like really interested in that as well. So I would say that there are kind of multiple intersecting sources.
And I know from reading the Q&A that the audience is especially grateful for your suggestions about living artists that can continue this. So thank you for that. That's great. They want to, clearly everybody in the audience gets that this is a book about a moment in modernism, early, starts in the 1920s, but continues to the 60s. And I think we're all interested in knowing where the story goes right up to the present. So thank you for that guidance. We're about out of time. We're going to finish up here. So, but I want to say one thing is that we've had more questions than I can get to, for which I apologize to the audience, but our time is limited. I've tried to organize the questions in such a way that Marci gets to hear at least different angles of different people's curiosity on this topic. And but we've never had an Inside the Center event that has so many people in the Q&A writing simply "thank you." So those aren't questions, but I think a lot of people want me to express their gratitude to you for this event and for introducing us to the book. And above all, congratulations on the publication this week of the book.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to mention that apparently a follow-up email from the center with a link to this event will also include a discount code for the book.
That's right. That's important. Yeah. And anybody that wants to buy the book, watch out for that email because it will include the code. So thank you again, Marci, very much. Now, to everybody who registered for today's event, you were automatically entered into a drawing to receive one of 3 signed copies of Marci Kwon's new book. And so I would like to announce the winners. They are Jasmine Reed, Christopher Botsford, and Nina Gorbach. Congratulations, and we will be in touch with the 3 of you about getting you your signed copy of the book. And now, one more programming note. Please hold Thursday, June 3rd for the next Inside the Center event featuring another current fellow at the Humanities Center, Frederick Clark, who is assistant professor of classics at the University of Southern California. Fred will be discussing his recent book, The First Pagan Historian, The Fortunes of a Fraud from Antiquity to the Enlightenment. More events are always being added to the calendar, and I hope you will want to join us again in the coming months. So as always, check our website, shc.stanford.edu, for the latest updates. Thank you so much, Marci. Congratulations, and we hope to see you all again here soon. Thank you.
Thank you.